Today, Numberwanging 1, 2, 3. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics for Investors Post, covering finance and property news with a distinctively Australian flavour. Today, I'm joined by journalist Tarric Brooker. Hi, Tarric.
G'day, Martin. How are you?
Yeah, pretty good. I'm confused.
Aren't we all, mate? You know, you've got this big, long list of all these economic indicators saying the labour market's still quite fragile, still struggling a bit, from services indexes to Roy Morgan's to the ABS's own numbers from payrolls and household surveys.
That's right, and my own surveys, both from SMEs and households. And yet, the ABS number yesterday was unemployment at 7%, but massive job growth.
Yeah, 218,000 jobs above consensus. It's something. It's certainly something. I mean, I believe the median estimate was something like 29,000 jobs lost or something like that, and we ended up getting 178,000 jobs created. And I don't see it, to be completely honest with you. The numbers for the job seeker came out recently from the Department of Social Services, and they showed about a 5% decrease in the number of recipients, which, you look at that and you go, well, that sounds pretty good. That sounds like it might support the jobs numbers. But then you have to factor in that at the end of September, the start of October, the assets and income test resumed. So up until the end of September, if your wife made $1 million and you lost your job, you could still get job seeker. And that was something that we'd seen in the media. But now all the normal tests have resumed and people who no longer qualify have all been booted off. And we've seen the uptick even in the number of recipients in the Commonwealth Bank's data, which shows that the amount being paid into people's account has actually risen, not fallen since that point. So here we are.
Well, and of course, remember that the official unemployment numbers doesn't take account of JobKeeper at all. So those numbers, means that there are still lots of people off the official numbers. And the Roy Morgan statistics are always significantly higher. And if you look at it closely, the other interesting thing, of course, is the segmentation by different age bands. There's massive pressures, particularly amongst younger workers in terms of jobs. And if you look also at the mix between full-time and part-time, again, there's more part-time than full-time. So even if you believe the top level number, which I have trouble doing, even if you go down another level, again, as soon as you start unpeeling the onion, you see more issues.
You do, and it's like that. It's like that across the board. You look at even at some of these other indicators. Say for example the CBA services PMI. You look at that and you go, oh well, that looks pretty good. It's been above 50 for a while. But I mean, obviously, then there's on the other side, there's the other services PMIs that show from AIG, which shows a different story. But then, by the same token, when you get down into the employment sub-index, there's no growth. There's been no employment growth at all since April, and but here we are discussing 178,000 jobs being created with basically very little of the supporting cast of the other indicators that you would expect.
Yes, and another example, I guess, of confusion is the Roy Morgan confidence index for households, which came up a little bit but is still below long-term trends. Compare that with the Melbourne Institute sentiment index, which is booming.
Yeah, and there's an important point to be made there regarding the Roy Morgan index. All these people keep showing me these charts that are based in January. And they're like, look how close we are to, we're only about 5-8 points off January levels. But they forget that was in the middle of the bushfires, when you had Sydney and Melbourne covered with smoke and people weren't feeling too great about things. But if you go back to the sort of the sort of 2019 levels, confidence is still down rather significantly. And it is what it is, I suppose.
Well, and the retail provisional index came out today and was reporting a small growth, but not dramatic, and of course that might get corrected. And the ABA published a whole series of data points on the repayment holidays that are now no longer repayment holidays, and so suddenly it's all looking wonderful. But actually, if you look carefully at those numbers, they're also a bit wobbly too.
Well, that's just the point, though, isn't it? I mean, like, we've been talking about this now for, since this crisis began, here in Australia. So what's that, about 8 months ago now? And it's all just a little bit, it's a bit ridiculous, to be honest, because people said back then, it's all going to be done by September. Everything's going to be all back to normal. It's going to be this V-shaped recovery. Now the V-shaped recovery that they're talking about is all the way into next year, which isn't terribly V-shaped in my opinion. It's more of a U. But by the same token, you'll just look at things and it's not there. If we had have turned off JobKeeper and turned off mortgage deferrals when they initially had have said that they were supposed to conclude, I have no doubt that we'd be looking at a much, much weaker property market. Confidence would be shot and we'd be in a completely different world. So I think it's really, really quite premature for all the spruikers and everyone else to be doing their victory laps, saying everything's over, everything's finished, when there's so much uncertainty, even just here in Australia, let alone in the rest of the world, where you've got the Northern Hemisphere heading into lockdown, fights over stimulus packages in the US and Europe, and and it's just, there's so much uncertainty. It's just I would hazard, I wouldn't hazard to make a guess as to how things could go well or how things could go horribly, horribly wrong.
Well, I do scenarios because I think you've got to take alternative paths from where we are. But it is important, isn't it, that originally it was going to be V-shaped in September, as you say, and now it's sort of longer term. And the reason that we've got the sort of performance we've got is the massive amount of flow of cash that's being thrown in through the various channels, the various levels of supports, the quantitative easing that the Reserve Bank has now started on as well. Very, very low interest rates. And I sometimes remind people that, the Reserve Bank a few years ago said, well, anything below 3% is pretty much impossible, never will be. And then 2.5, and then 1.5, 1.25, and then 0.1. So, there is something very, very concerning when, in fact, the whole basis of the economy is being driven by all of this, artificial support. And it is support, and it's blown up capitalism. It doesn't really exist anymore because nothing's allowed to fail. It also means, of course, that the true state of things is not going to be seen until the stimulus is withdrawn, but the chances are they'll just kick the can down the road and just continue to extend and pretend longer. And a good example is the insolvency rules, which of course are suspended at the moment, so you can trade insolvent up till the end of the year. I reckon they'll be extended. So I suspect this will go on for quite a lot longer than we think.
It's interesting just looking at how all these various different things intersect and how they actually end up, washing out in the economy. So, for example, in America, most of the support was tapered at the end of July, but we haven't actually seen the effects come through in even, say, the retail sales data until October. Until the end of October, and the data was done. So, even under the most dire circumstances where you've got over 20 million people unemployed and things are going very, very poorly, it's taken that time for that stimulus to wash through the economy, for people to, who may have put it away for a few weeks, who've now spending it later, all those sorts of, various variables that play in. So, this idea that we're already out of the woods is just a bit ridiculous, because stimulus only peaked last month. We're only about 14 days into things really being tapered in a significant way, and that's something that's just so incredibly important to keep in mind, because I just find it mad that we're talking about this economic recovery, that everything's going to be fine, and we're taking a data point the last few months, where the economy has been supported by unprecedented levels of stimulus being targeted at households and businesses, and then extrapolating that number forward and creating a trend line based on something that is no longer going to be there. So I got nothing. I mean, it just seems like bad economics to me. It just seems like something that they teach you in a year 9 business studies class and go, you see this quarter here? Yes, this quarter was incredibly good because of X input, and we're going to ignore that quarter. Then we're going to look at the longer term trend, and we're going to look at all these other underlying variables rather than basing it on that, because that is bad economics. But that's exactly what we're doing anyway.
Well, I actually think that the real thing to focus on is not the numbers at all, because I think the numbers are probably just distorting what's going on. But it's this concept of if enough people think positive and say positive things, that will improve confidence. That confidence will then translate into activity. That activity will then translate into economic output. That seems to me to be the logic that most people are actually pursuing at the moment. You can see it in the government statements. You can see it in all of the banks who've now basically turned their things on their head and saying, oh, no, we were wrong. House prices aren't going to fall 30%. They're going to rise 10%. Well, that was in 2 months. There is something just so artificial about this whole situation. And I'm, quite frustrated, really, that there seems to be no real grasping of the real core issues that are underlying where we are and what's going on. We seem to be just skirting around the edges.
Well, there's not really a whole lot of appeal for that. That's the problem. I mean, if I've learned anything in my time as a journo and in the media, is that it's about what is going to generate clicks. But at the end of the day, it's just the way the system works. And I think it's unfortunate, because I think people should be made aware of these different things. But by the same token, leaving aside the media for a second, we can only write what people tell us. It's like, sure, there are people like me who take things and run with it, but we're in a relative minority. I'm a commentator, not just a journalist. So it's we get given stuff from the property sector, we get given stuff by the banks. If one of the bank CEOs comes to me and goes, okay, I've got an article for you. This is the interview we're going to do. This is what I'm going to say. And okay, well, that's what I'm going to write. So it's just the way it is in the media. But it is sad, because people aren't being given the truth. They aren't being told about the downside risks, and they should be.
Yes, I am of the view that people should be treated as adults, and that they should be given warts and all, facts and figures and data, so that they can make their own decisions, but based on a pantheon of information that actually allows them to make a more accurate read as to what's going on. Whereas what I think is happening is that information is being filtered very heavily. It's being positioned, frankly, partly because of the factors that you've spoken about in terms of the way that the media works, and also, of course, that there are some very powerful voices with big pockets who can influence quite strongly through the front door and also through the back door, as it were, as to what gets out. And I also think all of these releases from, for example, the big four banks, they've all got economic departments. They all keep publishing stuff, and it's interesting how the stuff that they publish seems to be very much built around a particular worldview that may actually benefit them, and yet it's reported as pure fact. Yeah.
I mean, but that's the way it's always been here in Australia. You look back at all the, well, maybe not always, but more recently, at least in my time. You look back on all these various things. It's like, property price is going to rise X amount. This is going to happen. That's going to happen. And, it's interesting because in a lot of ways, they become self-fulfilling prophecies, because we have had the scope to expand the debt, expand the household balance sheets, drive housing prices higher, do all those various different things. And so they sort of, it all just stems from equity, mate, all the way onwards. Everything just sort of continues to fall into place, and it's quite sad in a lot of ways. And I'm quite frankly frustrated with the way things have played out here, because you've got all these people. I mean, you've still got 1.6 million people who are on Centrelink, who are collecting unemployment benefits, and confidence is roaring ahead to a 7-year high. Does that mean that we just don't care about all these people, about what they're going through? And there's sure as hell isn't anything for them in the budget. So I just think it's a little bit just a little bit narrow-minded, to be completely honest with you. We've got this very narrow view of, there's light at the end of the tunnel, there's a vaccine, there's going to be housing price growth, there's going to be all these different things. But I feel like we've lost something in the middle where we just go, oh, wait, there's all these other people who are really suffering too, people who are going to lose their businesses, people who are going to lose their homes. And there's just not really a whole heap of focus on them aside from the sort of random headlines from people like me and people like me who just, who do sort of point out these downside risks.
Yes. Oh, you see this, the Hilda data came out today, the latest release, only up to 2018, so it's still very old. That's one of my problems with Hilda. It takes too long for the data to come out. But what they highlighted, the fact that was that most households have seen very little increase in real income over the last few years, but there is a massive proportion of households, including many one-parent households, that are significantly financially worse off compared with a few years ago.
Yeah. Well, and I can only imagine that's only going to look even worse because since 2018, per capita growth has gone nowhere.
Yep.
On the basis of GDP, and that's at a time when we've been exporting increasing quantities of minerals and other things overseas, when actual growth is being driven by that and immigration. So in actual fact, I would imagine that the average household, in terms of their actual household income, rather than the median GDP number, is probably even poorer than it was in the Hilda survey.
Well, I certainly see that in my stress surveys, right? So we know that there's a chunk of the households who are doing very well, but there are a chunk of households who are not doing well and have significant cash flow issues, and the numbers going up. And that's all those factors that we've been talking about previously. And it may be masked to an extent by JobKeeper and JobSeeker and other things, but it's still there. And unfortunately, that side of the story doesn't want to get told.
No. It's interesting, isn't it? Like you look at the narrative. The narrative is, oh, we're going to cut stamp duty. There's the option that we're going to cut stamp duty in New South Wales. We're going to deregulate lending standards. And then you look at it and you go, all this is happening in March and April next year. Well, what else is happening then? Oh, that's right. JobKeeper is concluding. Potentially concluding, and it just speaks volumes. Like it's clear that the banks, that APRA, that the RBA, that the government are all concerned about what's going to happen next year, because nobody knows. Things could turn out better than we expect. It's possible, or things could turn out just as bad or worse than we expect. And I think that's what's so dangerous about some of these narratives, because confidence is a very fragile thing. Right now, confidence is roaring ahead. Everyone's, everyone in the Westpac survey anyway is looking very, very, excited and very happy about the road ahead. Highest level in, what is it, 7 years? But by the same token, if next year the insolvency moratorium does end, when it ends, whether it's on time or otherwise, and we do see a big sort of sizable proportion of businesses close, what is that going to do to confidence? To all these people who've been told ScoMo is a genius, that he's going to save everyone, who've all believed this narrative of the bridge to the other side, regardless of the other challenges and all the other evidence that's been presented to the contrary, presenting the downside risks. That the impact on that confidence, on that loss of confidence that could occur, is something that's going to be potentially even worse than just allowing things to play out as they naturally would have and things to recover organically. And that's something that you saw in the US in the financial crisis, because, people after they approved all the various bailouts and everything, people thought, okay, we're going to get back to normal. Things are going to be fine. The government stepped in and it's all going to be hunky-dory, 12, 18 months. And that's not what happened. As we know, housing prices kept falling for the next couple of years. People kept losing jobs for the next couple of years. And of course, confidence got kneecapped as a result. But of course, Wall Street roared higher. So, mission accomplished. But that's the issue that we now face here, especially with all these problems from overseas, because all it takes is another big shock like March, February, March, to occur again, to really sort of clamp down on the lending, to really sort of impact the financial system, and once again, it's on for young and old. So, I just struggle to sort of, yes, a positive outcome is possible. We've been saying that since the start. Yes, it's possible that, to use your analogy, the plane finds a safe place to land. But by the same token, it's, that is just one outcome of a plethora that are possible.
Yeah, and the IMF came out this week with a latest report on what they think is likely to happen, and they actually warned about more downside risk now emerging, particularly because of the virus in Europe and in the US. So they've become less bullish than they were a little while ago, and that's probably right. And if you look carefully at some of the underlying forward-leading indicators that I see, for example, households' interest in purchasing property, it's still very low. It's lower than it's been for a long, long time. That hasn't turned around. There's a little bit of at the margin, but probably investors are still pretty much out of the script at the moment. Net migration inwards is close to zero. International buyers not really playing ball either at the moment. And of course, we've got the China connection. And I think the China connection is becoming more and more of a question mark for me in terms of how this is going to play out because of all of the rock throwing backwards and forwards.
Well, it's not so much backwards and forwards, is it? It's more just they throw a big rock our way and we throw a little pebble back their way.
That's true.
I think that's something that's going to continue for the foreseeable future. Unless Biden goes on a 4-year caving expedition with President Xi, I don't really see that we're going to be able to restore the sort of, shall we call it, the pre-COVID status quo. And, we are on that sort of collision course. And that's something to keep in mind even on a longer term view. Yes, they're hurting coal and seafood and timber and a whole long list of other things. But that's only just a small microcosm of what we could see in the longer term. We are now on Beijing's, we're on their naughty list, and they're not going to buy any of our coal. So it's something that we really need to keep in mind in the sort of 5 to 10 year timeline, because right now we're enjoying some of the highest iron ore prices in history. Prices are very, very high. Volumes are at a record level as well. So that's a huge boon to the federal budget, a huge boon to headline GDP, but that's not going to last forever. The Chinese are pissed off with us. They're building all these new ports that can take these enormous ships, which manage to get down the cost of iron ore inputs, and they're gonna end up expanding their base of supply in Africa and in Brazil. That's eventually going to supplant us in time. Now, that's something we need to start planning for now. We need to be able to get these other industries, these other exports going in the next 5 to 10 years to be prepared for that. Because if iron ore goes to $30 a ton, we're stuffed. It's really that simple, unfortunately.
Well, the Treasury did do some modelling on the impact of a $10 move down on iron ore prices, and it was pretty scary stuff. So yeah, absolutely, we are very reliant on it. And I have this theory that China's stockpiling steel, and the question is how much longer will they go on doing that for? There are some early signs also of some bond defaults in China starting to come through. Well, you've seen those, but some of the leading indicators there look less good than they were too. So you wonder to what extent the economy in China is going to be able to continue its current level of performance as well, which may have an impact. So lots of risks.
Yeah, I have a bit of a different view on China. I think that they know they're in trouble. That they're not idiots. They don't believe their own hype and their own data that says everything's hunky dory. There is an absolute laundry list of fantastic sources. Things like China Beige Book, which go down into the nitty gritty of the Chinese data. They do the math and they show you how basically a lot of it is just, we'll call it inflated for the sake of being, diplomatic here. But it just goes to show that how unbalanced the Chinese recovery has been. They're heavily reliant on exports. They're heavily reliant on construction. You look at the construction index in China, that roared back. That was the most V-shaped recovery on the face of the planet. And that's going to continue, because if they don't keep pumping money into the construction sector, if they don't keep building ghost cities and roads to nowhere and infrastructure and apartments and all these various different things they do, if they don't build them, the Chinese economy is not going to achieve their goals. It's not going to get the 5% growth, and they're not even going to be able to justify saying that they got 5% growth. So that's something, in my view, that the conclusion I've come to, in the last 4 or 5 months, that they have to keep going. They have to keep buying more and more iron ore. They have to keep building more and more stuff, because without it, their economy is in serious, serious trouble. Because households and small businesses have not recovered to the point that the data claims, or that it is sort of inferred from the media coverage of this, explosive, broad-based Chinese recovery.
Yeah, no, certainly I would share your views in terms of reading the data as it's come out. And of course, the data is always questionable when it comes from that source, but below the surface, I think there are a few question marks. One last issue to explore today is parliamentary behaviour. In the last week we've had some rather worrying reporting in terms of what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. I guess my question is has it always been so, or do you think there's a new set of values now being preached?
Well, that's an interesting question. I suppose the thing is that in the past it was just sort of like, oh well, old Rob's, doing things on the side with, Cheryl, the parliament, the parliamentary assistant or the staffer or whatever. I mean, it's always happened. I mean, I think we'd be naive to think otherwise. But I think what has occurred now is that those sorts of things, at least elsewhere in the world, have become generally more damaging. Unless you're a French president, in which case it's almost encouraged.
or Italian.
Yeah, well, then it's not just encouraged; it's practically celebrated. Why'd you vote for this guy? Oh, he's the bunga bloke. But I think it's just emblematic of where we're at, I suppose. But realistically, you got to look at the polls. Look at the polling numbers. Is it really affecting the government? No, not really. To be honest, I don't think people really care. I think that there's I think, look, is it hypocritical that they come out and they talk family values and then they bar people from getting visas because they were adulterers and because they failed the character test? Yes, it's hypocritical. It's what's the word? It's just incredibly sort of narrow-minded that they think that they're in a separate class that can do that. But by the same token, at the end of the day, the ultimate arbiter is the public. And I think right now their focus is realistically on other things. Look, maybe it'd be different if we weren't in the middle of a crisis and people weren't worrying about paying their mortgage or having a job.
Well, that's why I asked, because it seems to me that there's this indignant class, right? And a lot of them are, of course, in the media and around the media who are pushing this quite hard. But if I, engage with more normal people, as I can put it like that, this doesn't seem to be an issue at all.
No, but to be completely honest, it's not just this. It's not just this issue. It's lots of other issues. It's the issues with say with like the airport, with them buying that land. It's the issues with the water rights, the other sort of dodgy dealings. The reef grants. There's probably, to be honest, there's probably in the billions in terms of the dodgy dealings. But at the end of the day, the public doesn't really care. I think that we've reached a point where the public have just disengaged from politics, where it's all just noise to them, and then they sort of switch on to a certain degree around an election, and then that's sort of pretty much it.
Yeah, well, that's what I was sort of angling towards, because that's, I think, my perspective. Certainly, if I look at my surveys and what's important, right? There are a set of issues that clearly are important, but those that we've discussed in the last few minutes just are not on the list at all. People are much more concerned about their own finances and the education for their kids, those sorts of things. Those sort of real life issues are the ones that people are concerned about. And some of this other noise, they just think it's, well, stupid and idiotic, but nothing to do with them, really.
No, and it's the same thing. Like people point to these polls, and they say, "Oh, look, 75% of people or 80% of people say that we should pursue action on climate change." And look, personally, I think we should. I think probably the loss of biodiversity and deforestation is probably going to be a bigger problem sooner. But that's just my opinion, rather than emissions and all that in the short term, at least. But by the same token, people don't vote that way. If people truly believe that the number one most important issue facing our nation was climate change, if 80% of people believe that wholeheartedly and truthfully, there is no way Scott Morrison would be Prime Minister. The Liberals would have got absolutely smashed. They'd be a shadow of their former selves, but that isn't what's happened. People care about climate change to a point. And that's what Joel Fitzgibbon's got right with, and he's covered a lot of shit for that from the Labor left. But he's right. People, Labor's out there, they're talking climate change, they're talking all this other stuff, and they're trying to appeal to this, subset of the electorate. But then by the same token, there's everyone else just going, am I going to have a job next year?
Yep.
Am I going to be, what is it, 11% of people who are, potentially, struggling with their mortgage, who could lose their house. They don't care about climate change right now. Very, very few people do. And that's something that they're going to have to really pivot and change in order, sort of change the tack. I mean, yes, they've still got to address the issue, absolutely. But by the same token, they need to do it in a way that it's going to be supportive of the other problems that people are having in the electorate.
Yeah, and I see a contention between two different streams of thought coming through again in my surveys. One is, the government will never let things get really bad. They'll always rescue us and save us, right? So, the government equals the cavalry, right? So they'll throw more liquidity in, they'll throw more support in, and everything's fine. That's the first one. The second is, when I make my vote, whether I'm pushing a button or whether I'm, putting a cross on a piece of paper, right? That's directly connected to my hip pocket, right? What happens to my finances and my prospects are the most critical thing of all, and everything else pales into insignificance. And a lot of people are holding those two, different thoughts, I think, in their mind at the same time. But I think it's the hip pocket that ultimately will determine the outcome.
Well, I suppose if you look at it just from a very individualistic perspective, it's sort of they're both almost one and the same in the sense that people just believe that the government will protect their hip pocket, that they are part of the chosen few that will be protected. And that's something I've been sort of wondering, and I think something that we could talk about. It's just in the sense of like, what degree of support do you think that we're going to get from the government in the new year? Because that really is the the $70 billion question.
Well, the $1.8 trillion question.
Well, in the long run, yeah, I would imagine so.
A small number. Well, the point is, we've got to the point now where, ScoMo is quite happy just to rack up the budget, right? And I really don't see any intent on turning it around. It's interesting, in the UK, there's some discussion now about, will taxes have to go up because of the extra spending that's actually going on at the moment. In fact, they've dialed back international aid, for example, and dialed back here, and they're talking about trying to sort of control some of the spending again. I see none of that here in Australia.
I think that's going to be something that's going to be very interesting now, because with these employment numbers, regardless of whether they're accurate or not, that doesn't matter. They are the go-to source for the government.
Yep.
So now ScoMo is going to enter next year with unemployment lower than they expected, with the economy on paper in terms of retail and everything else in place that was better than expected. And that stimulus isn't going to finish flowing through until after JobKeeper concludes. So he's really going to have a tough fight with the party room now. Now, if unemployment was higher, then he'd have an easier time justifying it. But now it makes it that much harder to continue the fiscal arm of extend and pretend. I mean, sure, they can, ramp out some other policies, but justifying a continued thing like, say, like JobKeeper, something that costs, billions and billions of dollars every month, has all of a sudden become all the more challenging. So in a lot of ways, as silly as this sounds, I mean, if you're a housing bear, if you're someone who thinks that the economy is going to struggle next year, in a lot of ways, that number is actually going to be supportive of your viewpoint potentially coming to pass in an ironic twist of fate. Because it's going to take time, and then once ScoMo has had his mission accomplished moment, like pushed it on the carrier, and say, look at what we've achieved, we've concluded JobKeeper, we're the best economic managers in the history of the world. That's when things start to get challenging. a few months after all the stimulus stops, and we start to see all this stuff wash through, and people, go through their savings to pay their mortgage, or go through what's left of their super that they pulled out and they squirreled away for a rainy day, and then things do get challenging. And I mean, like I said on Twitter, we're going to see this sort of really interesting battle between the forces of continued extend and pretend and a slowly deteriorating economy as that stimulus washes through.
Absolutely, and that's why I keep saying you've got to look longer term, right? You know, it's too soon to call which way this is going to go. You can bet your bottom dollar that there will be forces arguing for the removal of stimulus, and there'll be forces saying no, we've got to keep it going, right? And that will be a battle, and that will be a battle, I think, in the party room. I think it'll be a battle in the country as well. But the interesting question to me is where Labour fits in all this, right? Because I think they're going to be caught in the crossfire.
Labor are going to be in the position of, we need to spend more money, because that's the only position they can take. They're wedged into oblivion, to be completely honest with you. You've got the fiscally conservative party abandoning fiscal conservatism, so they still have the appeal to the right members of the electorate, to the sort of the minority groups, to the conservative groups, to the people who don't believe in all the woke stuff and all that sort of stuff that elements of Labor embraces. So in a lot of ways, once you take away the fact that Labor wants to be the bigger spending government, and you take that advantage out of the equation, it makes it very, very challenging for them to make a comeback, especially with ScoMo, with the benefits of incumbency and the benefit of, being the savior. That's how people see him. It's not how I see him, but I don't, it's, I'm not the one who decides elections. And that's something that's, I think, is really, really important to keep in mind going forward, because if they do go to an early election, while the stimulus is still washing through the economy, while things are still pretty good, and as long as we don't have another big global hit, or even if we do, as long as things here are sort of pretty good, I think things are going to be very, very challenging for Labor. And, I know Albo's getting a lot of the blame, and I don't think he's done a stellar job, well, less than stellar, to be completely honest, in a lot of ways. But by the same token, what can he realistically do differently? Promise to spend even more money?
Well, that's right, because in so many places now, they are sort of pretty much coextensive, right? The policy set is closer and closer together, right? And what's distinctive? And that for me is the real interesting question, right? Distinctiveness is important if you're actually going to be able to get a message out there, and particularly if you're going to want to engineer a change. Incumbency at the moment, I think, is worth quite a lot.
Definitely. I mean, especially given the fact that they can just keep pulling that lever on the continued support. I mean, I think the thing that's important to keep in mind is, if we are correct about the longer term nature of this crisis and the fact that there are more challenges to come, and that that there is going to be rougher times ahead for some Australians, or for many Australians, that the government can keep playing stimulus whack-a-mole for the next 5 or 10 years with very little impact on the overall creditworthiness of Australia. Federal gross federal debt is about 42% of GDP, which is about half or less than half of that in Europe. It's less than half of America. It's well less than half of America. It's about a third of what it is in America. So we could literally spend the next 10 years running JobKeeper till kingdom come, and we'd still, what's that? Say 150 billion, 10 years takes us to sort of, slightly above average of European levels. So call it 5 years. We could run JobKeeper for the next 5 years, 150 billion a year, full tilt, and we'd still be in a relatively decent position financially as a nation.
And meantime, other countries will be digging a deeper debt hole. So in relative terms, we'll still look better.
Yeah, exactly. So, I think that's something that people really need to keep in mind as they make their decisions, as they look at things, even as they assess the housing market. Is it possible that they're going to keep throwing support at this, billions and billions and billions, and they're going to prop it up? Sure, that's possible. I think, we had this conversation about, 8 months ago now. It was a question of they could, but should they?
Yeah. Well, that's always the question, isn't it? But the answer to that, if they think that actually is advantageous to getting re-elected, they will.
Yeah, exactly. Which is why, I think all this celebration of, property prices aren't going to fall, there's not going to be any issues, is one, premature, and secondly, it's wrong. Because it's all well and good to say, oh, look at the headline growth rates, look at the fact that Sydney's doing better. It's like, yes, but even if you just look at the core logic index, you forget about PEXA, you forget about domain and any other potentially contrarian indicators. You just look at core logic. There are some suburbs that have been absolutely smashed.
Yep.
That are getting hit extremely hard, and it's all well and good to say, oh, but look at Vaucluse, look at Coleroy, look at Palm Beach, look at all these really really affluent suburbs that are booming. But if you go out into the fringes in Sydney and Melbourne, you're seeing land prices falling, you're seeing housing prices falling, and now there's also going to be the double whammy of home builder, which is going to take away demand from it. Well, who's going to want a house in Caroline Springs in Melbourne if they can buy one down the road that's brand new and get a grant from the government and in net terms have it be cheaper?
Well, that's right. You're singing my song now, insofar that you have to go granular to understand what's going on. I was looking at Hunters Hill last night, just seeing what prices are done there, and they, for houses, they're higher than they've ever been, right? But that is not a typical suburb, right? And that's the point. A lot of the activity is at the top end of the market, small volume of transactions, small number of postcodes. The majority of people are living in postcodes where prices are actually still going south, and yet you wouldn't get that from all the media coverage.
No, and I regularly watch your postcode coverage in terms of when you do the big report, goes 20-30 minutes, and you go through all the various different granular details of houses versus units, and that's something I think is so important for people to think about, because okay, you buy a unit, but there could still be a rather significant downside. But then by the same token, if there's the more positive thing where you look at buying a house, and perhaps in that particular area, there isn't as much downside as you think, and maybe it is a good idea. That's something that you need to work out on your own. Something that you need to look at your data, talk to someone like Edwin who does it. His show on Monday was fantastic, by the way. I definitely recommend that for anyone who didn't watch it. Some very important tips in there for people looking at buying a house, whether they're a first home buyer or otherwise. But that's something to keep in mind. If you're in a place like Brisbane or Perth and you're looking at a specific suburb that hasn't seen that enormous price growth, that hasn't seen, things run away from you, maybe that's something that's worth looking at if you do have secure employment. Because, over the next 3 years, if you pay down your mortgage, you might end up better off, even if prices do fall. And that's something that's worth looking at Martin's data for. I know I'm, sort of talking up the bloke on his own show, but it's good stuff.
$5 coming through the mail, sir. But look, it is the point, right? It is the point that I keep coming back to, that in the current environment, the high-level information flows don't tell you anything, right? You have to go and look at individual postcodes, individual data points, look at units versus houses, and make decisions locally. I think that's probably, for me, the most critical point. And, if we can help on this channel, people unplug from the high-level noise and get to focus more on the detail in the particular area they're looking at, if they're looking at houses or the other decisions they're making, that's a good thing. And I think that is also, for me, one of the critical learning points, is to be able to get more informed so that you can make better decisions, as an individual or as a household, is the critical requirement at the moment, because you cannot rely on those high-level data points. The numbers are all over the place, doesn't tell you anything. Only when you go granular, only when you go detailed, do you actually get anything of any use.
No, exactly. That's the theme of the show, the Numberwang. That's where really where we're at the moment. All these various data points are all pointing in different directions. There's things saying that things are going to boom and things are going to be fantastic. There are other things that are saying that things are a disaster and they continue to be a disaster. And the truth is we don't really know definitively. So, like you say, it's just so important for people to get out there and do their own homework about their own area, their own industry, their own future, to be able to make those incredibly important decisions. And I don't envy them those decisions, because that's something I'm even looking at it myself at the moment. You look at things and you got to go, okay, well, if I look at this house in a rural area, if Martin's projections come to pass, how much is going to be knocked off the price? Am I going to end up in negative equity? All these different things are definitely considerations for people, and it's challenging. Probably the most challenging it's ever been.
Yep. Well, I've lived through a few crises. I've been around for a fair old time now, but I've never seen anything as complicated as this. This is right at the sort of the scale end of big issues, complexity, fast moving, lots of data, a lot of indicators going all different directions. So what I say to people is, go cautious, do the work. Also, ask yourself this question: what if I'm wrong? Right? So, you might have a hypothesis that this is the future, but what if it doesn't play that way? What if it goes the other way? And that what if scenario, I think, is also quite important at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's something that I've been giving a lot of thought to recently, because I'm not like some of these folks out there in the media who are all like I'm right, I'm 100% right, I'm always 100% right. It's like, yes, do I think I'm right? Yeah, of course I do, but by the same token, I've also got to look at things. What if I am wrong? What if you're wrong? What if our thesis is incorrect?
Absolutely.
What if the government is going to spend 150 billion a year propping up the economy for the next 5 years? How can we position ourselves so that we're prepared for the best of both worlds? How can we look at things and go, okay, well, maybe looking at this home in this area under these circumstances makes sense because of secure employment and X, Y, and Z. Maybe it does make sense. But then by the same token, you've got to look at things and go, well, the downside is X and Y, and this is a unit. So if it does come to pass, maybe it isn't worth the risk once you've done all the various, investigations and got it down into the nitty gritty. So, like you say, it's going to be something that's going to be challenging going forward, because we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know that somehow something might happen in the US and Biden's going to get $5 trillion worth of stimulus and he's going to flood the world with money, and we're going to see this post-depression economic boom type thing. But it could happen. I don't think it will happen, but it could. And that's something that we all sort of need to keep in mind, even without, if you are investing or if you're buying a property or if you're doing, it's something that you've got to think about. As hard as and as complicated and as brain-breaking as that is at times.
I'll give you one last brain-breaking thought. What if Trump gets back somehow?
Well, sometimes I do wonder what could happen. Did you see today with Mnuchin, the Treasury Secretary, saying we want to claw back all that aid money and everything.
Yep.
I don't know. Trump is a wild card. Things could get very interesting very quickly. But to be honest, I think he'll probably just go on pumping the stock market and then probably hassle McConnell into some sort of stimulus next year, I would imagine. So I suppose it really wouldn't be all that different. I think the real sort of wild card is if he just keeps going and then doesn't leave. Then things could get really interesting next year.
Yes, you can only have one president at one time, I think is probably the rule.
Yeah, well, apparently the Secret Service has said that if he isn't out by noon on the 20th of January, he's going to be physically removed. So to be a fly on the wall if that comes to pass, my lord.
Tarric, I appreciate your time today. Always love your perspectives on things, and we should do it again soon.
Yeah, definitely. I'm looking forward to it, mate.
Okay, take care.